The cruelest thing a man can do isn't cheating on his wife, it's making her feel invisible while the whole world watches. Rain shimmered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Blackstone Grand Hotel as Manhattan glowed beneath a cold October sky, the city lights stretching for miles like diamonds scattered across black velvet. Inside the ballroom on the 48th floor, the richest people in New York floated beneath crystal chandeliers worth more than most American homes, their champagne glasses catching flashes from cameras near the marble entrance. Tonight was supposed to celebrate 12 years of marriage between billionaire tech founder Ethan Callaway and his wife Naomi Brooks Callaway, the quiet woman who had spent over a decade standing beside one of the most powerful men in America. But at exactly 8:17 p.m., the entire atmosphere inside the ballroom shifted the second Ethan stepped out of the private elevator with another woman on his arm. Her name was Sienna Vale, a social media celebrity 20 years younger than Naomi, wrapped in a silver designer gown that sparkled under the lights as if she had been prepared specifically for photographs. Conversations stopped almost instantly. A violinist near the stage lowered her bow mid-note. Even the waiters carrying trays of lobster crostini slowed down as hundreds of eyes turned toward the entrance. Ethan barely seemed to notice the silence. He wore a midnight tuxedo tailored perfectly against his 6'2" frame, one hand resting casually against Sienna's waist while reporters rushed forward with cameras flashing in rapid bursts. "Mr. Callaway, over here," someone shouted. "Is this your new partner?" another voice called out. Ethan smirked slightly, the kind of smile built from money, power, and years of people never telling him no. "Tonight is about celebrating new beginnings," he answered smoothly. The room erupted into whispers. Some guests exchanged uncomfortable looks. Others pretended not to notice at all, because wealthy people in Manhattan had mastered the art of acting blind when power entered the room. Near the back of the ballroom, several board members from Callaway Technologies quietly checked their phones, clearly unsure whether this public spectacle had been planned or had simply spiraled out of control. Then the elevator doors opened again. This time, no one spoke at all. Naomi stepped out alone. She wore a simple black satin dress with long sleeves and no diamonds except for the wedding ring still resting on her finger. Her natural curls framed her face softly while the city lights reflected against her dark skin like warm bronze under candlelight. She wasn't dressed like a billionaire's wife trying to compete for attention. She looked calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that made people nervous without understanding why. Ethan glanced toward her briefly, his expression unreadable for half a second before he turned back toward the cameras. Sienna leaned closer against him possessively. Naomi noticed it. Everyone noticed it. But Naomi never changed expression. She simply walked across the ballroom in black heels, steady and elegant, as whispers followed behind her like smoke. "Oh my God," a woman murmured near the bar. "Did he seriously bring her here tonight?" Another guest shook his head slowly. "This is brutal." Yet Naomi kept moving as if none of it could touch her. She stopped near the center of the ballroom beneath the massive chandelier where golden light poured across polished marble floors. For a brief moment, Ethan finally looked directly at her. 12 years together. 12 years of building a life, building a company, building him. And somehow, standing only 15 feet apart, they looked like strangers. Ethan raised his champagne glass casually toward the crowd. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he announced confidently, his voice echoing through the ballroom speakers. "This evening marks an important new chapter in my life." More cameras flashed. Naomi stared at him silently. Then slowly, almost gracefully, her eyes drifted away from Ethan, and toward the executives seated near the front tables. One by one. As if she were counting them. Studying them. Waiting. And somewhere deep inside the ballroom, hidden beneath the music, the laughter, and the glittering performance of wealth, something dangerous had already begun. The orchestra continued playing softly beneath the chandelier light, but the energy inside the ballroom had changed completely. It no longer felt like a wedding anniversary. It felt like the moment before a storm finally broke over the ocean. Naomi stood near the center of the room with one hand resting lightly against the stem of a champagne glass she had not touched once since arriving. Around her, conversations restarted in careful whispers, the kind wealthy people used when pretending they were not discussing someone directly in front of them. Ethan remained near the stage beside Sienna, smiling for photographs while investors and executives approached one after another to congratulate him on what some were already calling his new era. But every few seconds, his eyes drifted back toward Naomi. Not because she was causing a scene. The problem was exactly the opposite. She was too composed. Too unreadable. Naomi slowly glanced around the ballroom, her eyes moving across familiar faces she had known for more than a decade. Men who used to sit at their dining table discussing startup investments when Callaway Technologies had been operating out of a cramped two-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn. Women who now wore custom Paris gowns but once borrowed Naomi's folding chairs during investor meetings because Ethan could not afford proper furniture back then. She remembered all of it. The unpaid electric bills. The cheap coffee at 3 in the morning while Ethan worked through coding failures. The winter nights when they split one takeout meal because every extra dollar had gone into the company. Back then, nobody cared that Naomi wore simple clothes or drove a used Honda Accord with 200,000 miles on it. Back then, Ethan used to look at her like she was the only thing keeping him alive. A server approached quietly with another tray of champagne. "Mrs. Callaway," he asked gently. Naomi smiled politely and took a glass this time. "Thank you." Across the room, Sienna laughed loudly at something one of the venture capitalists had said, her silver dress glittering beneath the lights while cameras continued snapping photographs. She leaned into Ethan. Naturally now, as if she already belonged beside him. Naomi watched them for a moment without expression. Then she lifted her champagne glass slightly and took a slow sip. The burn of cold champagne settled softly in her throat. Somewhere nearby, a woman whispered, "I cannot believe she even showed up tonight." Another answered quietly, "If my husband embarrassed me like this in front of New York City, I would have disappeared." Naomi heard both comments clearly. She reacted to neither. Instead, her attention shifted toward the front executive table where members of Ethan's leadership board sat exchanging uneasy looks. Richard Bennett, the company's chief legal officer, avoided eye contact completely. Melissa Grant from corporate finance kept checking her phone every 30 seconds. Even Daniel Mercer, Ethan's oldest business partner, looked uncomfortable enough to loosen his bow tie. Naomi noticed every detail. Because unlike everyone else in that ballroom, she knew exactly what was coming next. Ethan finally stepped onto the stage near the enormous 12-foot anniversary display surrounded by white roses and gold candles. The room slowly quieted again as he accepted a crystal microphone from the event host. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Ethan said smoothly, adjusting his cufflinks beneath the spotlight. 12 years ago, I had nothing except ambition and a dream. Today, Callaway Technologies is valued at over $4 billion. Applause filled the ballroom automatically. Ethan smiled proudly. "And sometimes," he continued, glancing toward Sienna beside the stage, "life requires the courage to embrace change." The applause weakened slightly this time. Naomi lowered her champagne glass carefully onto a nearby table. Then, for the first time that evening, she smiled. It was not the smile of a wounded wife trying to survive humiliation. It was the smile of someone who had already seen the ending long before anyone else realized the story had even begun. For several long seconds, the ballroom remained suspended in a strange silence after Ethan finished speaking. The skyline beyond the massive windows shimmered beneath the rain while golden. Candlelight reflected across polished marble floors and crystal glasses. Naomi stood perfectly still near the center of the room, her black satin dress flowing softly around her as musicians continued playing a slow jazz arrangement no one seemed to hear anymore. Ethan stepped down from the stage with the confidence of a man who believed the room still belonged to him. Sienna followed closely beside him, smiling for cameras while reporters pushed forward for better angles. "Mr. Calloway, our wedding bell's coming again soon," one reporter joked carefully. Several people laughed nervously. Ethan slipped one hand into his pocket and glanced toward Naomi for the briefest moment before answering. "Life changes," he said calmly. "Sometimes people outgrow old versions of themselves." The comment landed harder than he intended. Naomi heard the soft reactions immediately. A few guests looked down at their drinks. Others stared openly at her, waiting for anger, tears, or humiliation. But Naomi only tilted her head slightly, almost as if she were listening to music no one else could hear. Ethan seemed unsettled by her calmness now. That had always been the problem with Naomi. He could never fully read her when she went quiet. Years ago, during the early startup days, her silence used to comfort him. Tonight, it felt dangerous. Sienna reached for Ethan's arm again. "The photographers want another picture near the roses," she whispered softly. Ethan nodded automatically, but before he could move, the vibration of a phone echoed from one of the executive tables. Then another. And another. Within seconds, nearly every senior executive inside the ballroom was staring down at their screens with sudden confusion. Naomi noticed it immediately. So did Richard Bennett from legal. His face lost color so quickly it almost looked unreal beneath the chandelier lights. Melissa Grant froze halfway through lifting her wine glass. Daniel Mercer stood abruptly from his chair. Ethan frowned. "What is going on?" he asked sharply. No one answered right away. Around the room, whispers began spreading again, but differently this time. Not gossip. Panic. Naomi calmly picked up her champagne glass once more and took another slow sip. Across the ballroom, Richard finally approached Ethan holding his phone tightly in one trembling hand. "Ethan," he said quietly, trying not to draw attention even though every eye in the room was already watching them. "We have a situation." Ethan lowered his voice. "What situation?" Richard swallowed hard. An internal legal notice was just released to all board members and shareholders. Ethan's expression darkened instantly. "Released by who?" Richard hesitated. His eyes drifted toward Naomi. That was the first moment Ethan felt something cold move through his chest. Not fear exactly. Something worse. Uncertainty. Sienna looked confused beside him. "What is happening?" she whispered. No one answered her either. More phones continued vibrating around the ballroom as executives opened the same document one after another. Some looked shocked. Others looked terrified. Naomi slowly set her empty champagne glass onto a passing silver tray before finally walking forward across the marble floor. Her heels echoed softly through the silence now consuming the ballroom. Ethan watched her approach with growing tension in his jaw. For the first time all night, the cameras were no longer pointed at him. Every lens had shifted toward Naomi instead. She stopped only a few feet away from Ethan beneath the massive anniversary display covered in white roses. Up close, he could see how calm her eyes were. No tears. No rage. Just certainty. "Naomi," Ethan said carefully, forcing a controlled smile for the crowd around them. "If this is some kind of misunderstanding, we can discuss it privately." Naomi looked at him for a long moment before speaking softly enough that only the nearest guests could hear her. 12 years ago, Ethan, we promised never to embarrass each other in public." Ethan's expression tightened. Naomi glanced briefly toward the executives still frozen with their phones in hand. Then she looked back at her husband. "But since tonight seems to be about new beginnings," she said gently, "I suppose honesty belongs in the room too." And suddenly, for the very first time that evening, Ethan Calloway realized he was no longer the one in control. The silence inside the ballroom became almost unbearable after Naomi spoke. Beyond the rain-covered windows, Manhattan continued glowing in silver and gold beneath the October night, completely unaware that one of the city's most powerful men was beginning to unravel under the weight of a truth he had never seen coming. Ethan stared at Naomi as if searching for some sign that this was temporary, manageable, fixable. But her face remained calm beneath the chandelier light, composed in a way that made the tension spreading across the ballroom even worse. Around them, executives continued opening the same legal document on their phones while whispers moved rapidly between tables. Sienna looked from face to face in growing confusion. "Can somebody please tell me what is happening?" she asked quietly. Richard Bennett adjusted his glasses with trembling fingers before speaking carefully toward Ethan. "The ownership disclosure was filed through Hamilton and Reed 30 minutes ago," he explained. "It became effective at 8:45 tonight." Ethan frowned sharply. "What ownership disclosure?" Richard hesitated again. Naomi answered for him. "The one you never bothered reading 12 years ago." Ethan turned toward her completely now, his expression darkening beneath the ballroom lights. "Naomi, enough games." "This was never a game," she replied softly. A nearby executive lowered his phone slowly, visibly stunned. Another investor whispered, "My God," Ethan noticed it immediately. The room was changing around him. The confidence he had walked in with only an hour earlier was quietly evaporating under hundreds of watching eyes. Naomi reached into the small black clutch resting at her side and removed a folded document sealed inside a slim leather cover. Even before she opened it, Richard Bennett looked like he wanted the ground beneath him to split apart. Naomi held the papers carefully between her fingers. "When Callaway Technologies was founded," she said calmly, "the company required emergency funding after your second investor backed out." Ethan remained silent. Naomi continued. "You were 29 years old, 3 months behind on rent, and convinced your dream was over." Small flashes of memory crossed Ethan's face instantly. The tiny apartment in Brooklyn. Cold pizza boxes stacked near computer monitors. Naomi sitting beside him at sunrise while he rewrote code for 16 straight hours. "I remember," Ethan answered quietly. Naomi nodded once. "What you do not remember is who kept the company alive." The ballroom fell completely still again. Naomi opened the document slowly. The first controlling investment into Callaway Technologies came from Brooks Capital Holdings. Ethan blinked. "That was a private equity bridge loan." "No," Naomi said gently. "It was my family trust." Ethan's face drained of color. Somewhere nearby, someone audibly gasped. Sienna looked completely lost now, staring at Ethan as if realizing she had walked into a world she did not understand at all. Naomi held Ethan's gaze steadily. "My grandfather created the trust before he died," she explained. "I used it to save your company after the banks rejected you." Ethan shook his head once in disbelief. "That is impossible." Naomi handed him the document. Page 4. His hands moved slower than usual now as he opened the paperwork beneath the chandelier light. Every sound inside the ballroom seemed distant except for the rain striking the windows and the quiet rustling of paper between his fingers. Then he saw it. Ownership percentages. Legal signatures. Transfer structures. Controlling shares. Naomi Brooks Callaway. Ethan's breathing changed instantly. Richard lowered his eyes toward the floor. The trust retained majority voting control through a silent holding agreement, he admitted quietly. Legally, Mrs. Callaway has always remained the controlling shareholder of Callaway Technologies. For a moment, Ethan simply stared at the page as if the words refused to make sense. 12 years. 12 years believing he built an empire alone while standing beside the woman who had quietly owned the foundation beneath it the entire time. Naomi watched him carefully, not with cruelty, but with the sadness of someone finally exhausted from carrying a truth too heavy for too long. "You spent years calling me ordinary," she said. Softly. "But Ethan, ordinary women do not build billion-dollar companies in silence. And suddenly every camera flash inside the ballroom turned away from the billionaire on stage, and toward the woman he had underestimated for 12 years. The atmosphere inside the Blackstone Grand Hotel no longer resembled a celebration. The soft jazz music still drifted through the ballroom, waiters still moved carefully between marble tables carrying untouched champagne, and Manhattan still glowed beyond the rain-covered windows, but something fundamental had shifted in the room. Power had changed hands. Ethan stood frozen beneath the chandelier lights with Naomi's legal documents still open in his hands while hundreds of eyes remained fixed on him. For years, he had been the center of every room he entered. Tonight, he looked like a man discovering his own life had been built on a truth he never bothered to understand. Sienna slowly stepped away from him without even realizing she was doing it. The confidence she carried earlier had disappeared beneath the weight of whispers now spreading through the ballroom like wildfire. "She owns the company," someone whispered near the bar. "Not just owns it," another voice answered quietly. "She controls it." Naomi remained calm in front of them all, her posture elegant and steady beneath the golden light. There was no triumph in her face. No cruelty. If anything, she looked tired. Tired of carrying silence for too many years. Ethan finally looked up from the documents. "You hid this from me." Naomi's expression softened slightly. "No, Ethan," she replied quietly. "You ignored it." The words landed harder than shouting ever could. Richard Bennett cleared his throat nervously beside them. Mrs. Calloway also activated Section 9 of the Shareholder Protection Agreement effective tonight. Ethan turned sharply toward him. "What does that mean?" Richard hesitated before answering. "Emergency Executive Review Authority." Ethan stared at him. "Speak clearly." Richard swallowed. "It means the board can immediately suspend leadership access if the majority shareholder believes the company's public stability has been compromised. 4. The first time in years, genuine panic flashed across Ethan's face. "You cannot be serious." Melissa Grant from finance stepped forward carefully, her voice barely above a whisper. "The board already received notice 10 minutes ago." Ethan looked around the ballroom at the executives who suddenly could not meet his eyes anymore. Men who used to laugh at his jokes now looked deeply uncomfortable beneath the camera flashes surrounding them. The realization hit him slowly. They were no longer standing behind him. They were waiting to see what Naomi would do next. Sienna touched Ethan's arm gently. "Maybe we should leave," she whispered. Ethan pulled away distractedly without looking at her. His attention remained locked on Naomi. "You planned this?" he asked quietly. Naomi glanced around the ballroom at the anniversary decorations, the white roses, the enormous gold display with their names written across it like a monument to a marriage already collapsing in public. "No," she answered softly. "I planned to protect what I built." Ethan laughed once under his breath, but there was no confidence left inside it. "You are doing this because of her?" He glanced toward Sienna briefly. Naomi followed his eyes calmly. "This stopped being about another woman a long time ago." The rain outside intensified against the glass windows while distant thunder rolled somewhere over the Hudson River. Around them, reporters continued capturing every second of the unraveling empire. Naomi stepped slightly closer now, lowering her voice enough that only Ethan could hear clearly. "Do you know what the saddest part is?" she asked gently. Ethan said nothing. Naomi looked directly into his eyes. "I would have given you everything willingly." Ethan's jaw tightened. Memories flooded him all at once. Naomi sleeping beside him on the office couch during investor meetings. Naomi bringing coffee during endless coding nights. Naomi selling her own jewelry years ago without telling him so payroll could clear on time. All the moments he buried beneath success. And suddenly, standing in the middle of the ballroom he once believed belonged entirely to him, Ethan realized something terrifying. Naomi had never needed his money, his status, his last name. He had needed hers. Richard's phone buzzed again sharply in the silence. He checked the screen before looking up carefully. The board wants an emergency meeting at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Ethan looked at him coldly. And if I refuse? Richard lowered his eyes. You no longer have the authority to refuse. A wave of whispers swept through the ballroom once again. But Naomi did not stay to watch his humiliation grow. She simply reached up slowly, removed her wedding ring beneath the chandelier light, and placed it gently on top of the legal documents still trembling in Ethan's hands before turning toward the elevators without looking back once. The elevator doors closed softly behind Naomi as she descended from the ballroom alone, leaving the sound of whispers, camera flashes, and shattered pride 48 floors above her. For several seconds after she disappeared, nobody inside the Blackstone Grand Hotel moved at all. Ethan still stood beneath the anniversary display with the wedding ring resting cold in his palm while rain streaked down the enormous windows overlooking Manhattan. The gold letters displaying their names now looked almost mocking beneath the chandelier light. Sienna shifted uneasily beside him, her silver gown suddenly feeling out of place in a room no longer celebrating glamour. Ethan, she whispered carefully, say something. But Ethan could not. Because for the first time in years, his mind was no longer filled with certainty. It was filled with memories. Tiny memories he had buried beneath wealth and headlines and billion-dollar deals. Naomi asleep at the kitchen table with legal papers spread around her at 3 in the morning. Naomi quietly paying employees from her own account during their second year in business when investors disappeared. Naomi standing outside their first office building in the freezing New York winter, smiling proudly at a company logo she secretly owned more of than he ever realized. Around the ballroom, executives began leaving in uncomfortable silence. Nobody wanted to remain trapped inside the ruins of a public collapse. Daniel Mercer approached Ethan carefully, loosening his tie again as though he could not breathe properly. You should come home, he said quietly. Ethan stared at Naomi's ring in his hand. Did you know? Daniel hesitated too long. That was answer enough. Ethan looked up slowly. How many people knew? Daniel lowered his eyes. The original legal team. Richard. A few board members. Ethan laughed bitterly under his breath. So everyone knew except me. She made us sign confidentiality agreements years ago, Daniel admitted softly. Naomi never wanted credit. She only wanted stability. Ethan looked toward the elevator Naomi had disappeared into. Stability. The word cut deeper than anger somehow. Because Naomi had given him exactly that for 12 years while he spent those same years slowly convincing himself she was simply part of the background of his success. Sienna folded her arms tightly. I do not understand why everybody is acting like she is some kind of hero, she muttered quietly. Daniel looked at her carefully before answering. Because without Naomi Brooks Calloway, none of us would even be standing in this ballroom tonight. The words landed heavily between them. Ethan suddenly realized something humiliating. Sienna had never truly known him before the money, before the magazine covers, before the penthouse overlooking Central Park. Naomi had known him when he could barely afford subway fare. When he wore the same gray hoodie every day because he only owned 2 decent shirts. When rejection letters arrived weekly and his confidence cracked more often than anyone saw. And somehow, after building an empire together, he had reduced her to something ordinary in his own mind simply because she never demanded applause. A phone buzzed again in Ethan's pocket. Then another. Financial news alerts. Social media clips. Headlines exploding across the internet. Callaway CEO publicly humiliated after shock ownership reveal. Secret female majority owner of billion-dollar tech company exposed. Who really built Callaway Technologies? Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Every major business outlet in America was already tearing the story apart. Across the ballroom, staff quietly began extinguishing candles around the anniversary display while waiters removed untouched champagne glasses from tables. The celebration was over. Ethan loosened his bow tie slowly, suddenly feeling exhausted in a way he had not experienced in years. "Where did she go?" he asked quietly. Richard Bennett answered from nearby. "Home, I assume." Ethan looked toward the rain outside the windows. "No," he said softly. "That penthouse stopped being home for her a long time ago." And somewhere beneath the storm clouds hanging over Manhattan, Naomi sat alone in the back of a black town car moving through the city streets she once crossed beside the man who now stood in silence, realizing he had spent years abandoning the only person who truly loved him before the world learned his name. By the next morning, Manhattan was drowning in headlines. Every business network in America replayed footage from the anniversary gala on an endless loop while financial analysts dissected the shocking ownership revelation with stunned disbelief. Giant screens in Times Square flashed images of Naomi beside phrases like silent founder and the hidden power behind Callaway Technologies. Comment sections exploded across the internet. Some people called her brilliant. Others called Ethan a fool. But the people who truly knew the story remained silent, because they understood something the media did not yet fully grasp. Naomi had not destroyed Ethan overnight. He had slowly destroyed himself over years of forgetting the woman who stood beside him before success arrived. At 7:43 the next morning, Ethan stepped out of a black SUV in front of Callaway Technologies headquarters in Midtown Manhattan. Rain still covered the sidewalks from the night before while reporters crowded behind security barricades shouting questions the second they saw him. "Mr. Callaway, did your wife secretly own the company the entire time? Is the board removing you as CEO? Did you misuse shareholder information?" Ethan ignored every question as flashes exploded around him. He had not slept at all. His tie hung slightly loose beneath his charcoal overcoat, and dark circles rested beneath eyes that once appeared untouchable on magazine covers. Inside the elevator leading to the executive floor, the silence felt suffocating. Normally employees greeted him immediately. Normally assistants rushed toward him carrying schedules and coffee orders. Today, people avoided eye contact completely. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked almost sympathetic. Somehow that felt worse. When the elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, Ethan froze instantly. Naomi was already there. She stood near the massive glass conference room overlooking the Manhattan skyline, dressed in an ivory suit with her dark curls resting neatly over one shoulder. Morning sunlight pushed through the clouds behind her, wrapping the room in pale gold light. She looked calm. Focused. Like someone who had finally stopped carrying dead weight. Ethan stared at her for several seconds before speaking. "You came early." Naomi glanced toward him briefly. "I always came early," she answered softly. The words cut deeper than she intended. Because it was true. For 12 years, Naomi had quietly arrived before everyone else and stayed after everyone left while Ethan stood in front of cameras accepting praise for work that had never belonged entirely to him. The board members slowly entered the conference room one by one, carrying tablets and legal folders. Nobody spoke much. Richard Bennett avoided Ethan's eyes entirely while Melissa Grant remained focused on financial reports spread across the table. Finally Daniel Mercer cleared his throat carefully. "We should begin." Ethan took his seat at the head of the table automatically before realizing something strange. Naomi's folder rested there instead. A small detail. But humiliating. He slowly moved one chair down without saying a word. Naomi noticed it. So did everyone else. Richard activated the presentation screen at the front of the room. As of 8:45 p.m. yesterday evening, he began formally. Majority shareholder authority transferred active executive oversight to Mrs. Naomi Brooks Callaway under the Shareholder Stabilization Clause. Ethan leaned back heavily in his chair. Hearing her name spoken that way inside his own company felt unreal. Naomi remained composed beside him, reviewing documents quietly while sunlight reflected against the glass walls around them. Due to public reputation concerns and pending internal review, Richard continued carefully, the board will now vote regarding temporary suspension of executive authority. Ethan laughed once under his breath, exhausted more than angry. Amazing, he muttered quietly. After everything I built. Naomi slowly lifted her eyes toward him then. No, Ethan, she said gently. After everything we built. The room fell silent again. Daniel Mercer lowered his gaze toward the table. Because deep down, every person inside that conference room knew she was right. Ethan had become the face of the empire. But Naomi had always been its foundation. Richard passed electronic voting tablets across the table one by one. Ethan looked around the room at people who once followed him without question. Investors. Executives. Friends. Yet nobody could meet his eyes now. One by one, votes appeared silently across the conference screen. Approved. 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 Ethan stared at the results while a strange emptiness settled inside his chest. Not rage. Not humiliation. Regret. Because at that exact moment, watching Naomi sit across from him with quiet dignity while the empire shifted toward her hands completely, Ethan finally understood the cost of underestimating a woman who loved him long before the world ever did. 3 weeks later, the city no longer spoke about anything else. Every financial podcast, every business magazine, every morning television segment continued replaying the story of Naomi Brooks Calloway, the silent shareholder who stepped out from the shadows and reclaimed control of one of the largest technology companies in America. But while the media turned her into a symbol overnight, Naomi herself disappeared almost completely from public view. No interviews. No emotional statements. No attacks against Ethan. That silence unsettled people even more. Because in a world addicted to public drama, Naomi moved with the calm precision of someone who no longer needed validation from anyone. On a cold Thursday evening in November, black luxury vehicles lined the entrance of the Forbes Women in Leadership Summit at Lincoln Center. Camera flashes reflected across polished stone while New York's elite stepped onto crimson carpets beneath giant golden lights. Reporters crowded near the entrance hoping for celebrities and billionaires. But the moment Naomi arrived, the entire atmosphere shifted instantly. She stepped out of a black town car wearing a cream-colored tailored coat over a dark emerald gown that moved softly against the evening wind. No diamonds covered her neck. No dramatic entourage surrounded her. Yet somehow every camera in front of Lincoln Center turned toward her immediately. Naomi, reporters shouted. Mrs. Calloway, over here. How does it feel becoming the most powerful woman in tech? Naomi paused only briefly beneath the lights, offering a calm smile before continuing inside without answering a single question. The elegance of her silence had become more powerful than statements ever could. Upstairs, the Grand Theater glowed beneath soft gold lighting while leaders from across the country gathered beneath massive crystal fixtures. CEOs. Senators. Investors. Founders. Women who built companies from nothing. Naomi sat quietly near the front row reviewing notes on a slim black tablet while conversations buzzed around her. Several executives approached carefully throughout the evening to introduce themselves. Some congratulated her. Others apologized indirectly for remaining silent all those years while Ethan took sole credit for the empire they secretly knew Naomi helped create. Naomi responded to every person with quiet grace. No bitterness. No arrogance. Across the theater balcony, Ethan watched everything alone. He had arrived quietly through a private entrance 30 minutes earlier after receiving an invitation from Daniel Mercer, who insisted the company still needed public unity during the transition period. But the truth was much simpler. Ethan came because he could not stop thinking about Naomi. Over the past 3 weeks, Sienna had slowly disappeared from his life almost as quickly as she entered it. The glamorous dinners stopped. The constant attention faded. The relationship that once looked exciting beneath camera flashes suddenly felt hollow once headlines turned ugly. Naomi, meanwhile, seemed stronger every day. Ethan stood near the balcony railing in a dark navy suit, watching the woman he once considered invisible become the center of admiration in a room filled with America's most influential people. Then the host finally stepped onto the stage. "Tonight," she announced warmly, "we honor a woman whose story has reminded millions that true power does not always speak the loudest." Applause filled the theater. "Please welcome Naomi Brooks Calloway." The entire audience rose to their feet instantly. Ethan felt his chest tighten as Naomi stood gracefully from her seat beneath the golden stage lights. The applause grew louder, echoing through the theater while cameras flashed around her. Yet Naomi did not look overwhelmed by the attention. She looked peaceful. As if she had finally stepped into the life she was always meant to live without shrinking herself for someone else's comfort. Naomi reached the podium slowly and looked out across the crowd for a brief moment before speaking. "For many years," she said softly, "I believed love meant making yourself smaller so another person could shine brighter." The theater became completely silent. Ethan lowered his eyes. Naomi continued gently. "But real love never asks a woman to disappear." The words hit him harder than any public humiliation ever could. Because standing there beneath the lights while the world applauded the woman he once ignored, Ethan realized something devastating. Naomi had not changed. The world had simply finally seen her the way he should have all along. Winter arrived quietly over Manhattan, wrapping the city in silver skies and cold evening rain that painted every avenue with reflections of gold and white light. Nearly 4 months had passed since the night of the anniversary gala, yet people still spoke about Naomi Brooks Calloway as if she had become something larger than a business figure. Her face appeared on magazine covers across the country beside headlines about leadership, resilience, and reinvention. Calloway Technologies had stabilized under her direction faster than analysts predicted, and for the first time in years, employees inside the company described the culture as calm instead of exhausting. Naomi changed very little publicly. She still arrived early. Still dressed elegantly without trying to impress anyone. Still carried herself with the quiet dignity that once made people overlook her entirely. The difference now was simple. Nobody overlooked her anymore. One snowy evening in December, the Metropolitan Opera House hosted a charity event attended by politicians, executives, and old money families from across New York City. Crystal lights shimmered against polished marble while classical music drifted through the grand lobby filled with black tuxedos and designer gowns. Near the balcony overlooking Lincoln Center Plaza, Ethan stood alone with both hands resting against the railing, watching snowflakes disappear beneath the city lights below. He looked different now. Thinner somehow. Quieter. The sharp confidence that once followed him into every room had faded into something more human. More honest. He had spent months trying to repair the damage inside his company, but no financial recovery could touch the emptiness waiting for him every night inside the penthouse Naomi had long since moved out of completely. The silence there had become unbearable. No jazz records playing softly in the kitchen. No books scattered beside the couch. No faint scent of her perfume lingering near the hallway mirror. Just expensive rooms filled with the echo of someone he failed to appreciate while he still had the chance. Behind him, guests suddenly began whispering again. Ethan turned slowly. Naomi had arrived. She wore a deep black velvet gown beneath a long cream-colored coat while snowflakes melted softly against her curls as she entered the opera house lobby. She was not trying to command attention, yet attention followed her naturally anyway. People greeted her with admiration now. Respect. Some even moved aside instinctively as she walked through the crowd with calm elegance. Ethan watched her from across the room, his chest tightening with something deeper than regret. Loss. Real loss. Naomi eventually noticed him standing alone near the balcony. For a moment, neither of them moved. The orchestra music drifted softly through the opera house while snow continued falling outside the giant windows behind them. Then Naomi walked toward him slowly. Ethan straightened slightly, almost nervous in a way he had not felt in decades. When she finally stopped beside him near the balcony railing, the city lights reflected softly in her eyes. "You look cold," she said gently. Ethan smiled faintly. "I think that happens when someone spends too long losing the only warm thing in his life." Naomi lowered her eyes briefly toward the snow outside. The old Ethan would have expected forgiveness in this moment. A dramatic reconciliation. Another chance handed to him simply because he finally understood her value. But Naomi had changed too much for that now. Or perhaps she had simply stopped abandoning herself for someone else's comfort. Ethan looked at her carefully. "I was going to apologize," he admitted quietly. "But I do not think apologies fix this anymore." Naomi nodded softly. "No," she answered. "They do not." The honesty in her voice hurt more than anger ever could. Somewhere behind them, guests continued laughing beneath golden chandeliers while the orchestra prepared for the next performance. Life moved forward. It always did. Ethan stared out across Manhattan for a long moment before speaking again. "I spent years believing success meant becoming untouchable," he said quietly. "But the truth is, I was never powerful enough to deserve you." Naomi looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time in a very long time, Ethan saw no resentment in her eyes. Only peace. And somehow, that peace made losing her permanent. Naomi offered him a small, graceful smile before stepping back toward the glowing ballroom behind her. "Goodbye, Ethan." He watched her walk away beneath the golden lights without trying to stop her this time. Because deep down, he finally understood something too late. Some women do not destroy a man by taking his money or his empire. They destroy him by leaving with their dignity intact, and teaching him exactly what he lost. After it is already gone forever.